Hello everybody, welcome back to another Wainrider Wednesday, the weekly series where we take a look at progress for the upcoming mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, Total War Wainriders, set in the Third Age of Middle-earth, well before the events of the War of the Ring. And in this one, we're taking a look at a faction called, we're calling them the Black Forest Tribes. This is a sort of a coastal faction that has territories stretching from the mouth of the Brandywine River all the way down past the Gwathlo, or the Grey Flood, down towards the mouth of the Eisen, actually. So they own a considerable amount of territory on the map, and we're going to take a look at them on the campaign map to see what their starting position looks like, to see where their settlements are disposed, and so on. And this is a faction that I'm very much looking forward to. This is one that I just have very fond memories of designing this faction for whatever reason. I think it's partly that I love factions with very simple, even primitive unit rosters, and the Black Forest Tribes, as you may know if you've seen the other preview video for this faction on the channel, which goes into detail about their unit rosters, you'll know that they are a somewhat of a bare bones faction featuring no cavalry whatsoever, focusing on, you know, spears, axes, that type of thing. It was a faction that had a pretty clear vision from the beginning, and so I've got sort of a soft spot for them. Also, as you can tell, they are a faction that is, you know, maybe one of the more lonely factions in Middle-earth. I don't believe they will start really having a considerable border with any other faction, certainly not to their east or south. They may technically kind of border the elves to the north, or the high elves at any rate, but that's not going to be too much of a factor for them. There's lots of relatively empty, open territory to their east, and despite being, you know, to some extent in the in the middle, vertically speaking, of the map, they don't have a lot of near neighbors to worry about in the early game. So these guys may emerge as something of a sleeper threat later on. So let's take a look at the faction intro text that I've come up with for the Black Forest Tribes. And as always, we're going to take a moment to just remind everyone that this stuff should be considered somewhat of a work in progress. The difficulty factor here, we imagine these guys will be one of the more difficult factions to play, although I'm not totally sure about that. I think certainly we want them to feel very difficult, and we want them to feel very outclassed compared to the surrounding factions. Certainly compared to a faction like Arnor to the north, the High Elves nearby, even a faction like the Chiefdom of the Angren, which in some ways is akin to the Black Forest Tribes, at least distantly. These guys will feel very very primitive, I guess. So laughing at live dragons maybe in that sense, but I think in actual gameplay, if you play your cards right, you may have a pretty swift and interesting time with them. But anyway, on with the intro text. The dark heights of the Aran Vorn receive the winds of the sea. Of late, the winds bring only clouds and rain and the smell of salt, but in the days of long ago, before the dark years, the winds brought great ships like floating houses bearing men tall and stern. These strangers made settlements along the coasts to the south. They disturbed the land. They hewed down trees, and they made war. Only dim memories and faded stories remain of those days when the fearsome elves fought against the loathsome orcs of the Dark One, who brought fire and ruin to the waste the new-come men had made. Now there come stories of wraiths and evil hillfolk from the north, while rumors whisper of other troubles far to the east. But from stockaded homesteads deep in the pines of the Blackwood, and from villages hidden among the reeds, the people of the forests and the coasts have begun to gather. Far from the eyes of the mighty kings of men, the tribes are growing strong under warlike chieftains. It has been many lives since they crept from the shelter of wood and bog, but the time is at hand when the foes of the Black Forest will go in fear of the night, when the wind will speak to those enemies of the feathered shaft and the hidden spear. I also want to not let the opportunity go by to talk about how much I love some of these unit cards that Valor has designed for the factions. This is actually an in-game unit card for one of the highest tier units for these guys. I can't remember their name, but at any rate, two-handed axes, stepping on the neck of a downed Gondorian soldier desperately reaching for his sword. So fantastic stuff, maybe give you a bit of a sense of kind of the theme we were going for. The reference here is to, very, very ancient stuff, of course. The Numenorian arrival, the conflicts between the Numenorians, the elves, and even the Gwathwirim, right? These folk of the river, of the woodlands, in the Second Age. And the question might be asked: how likely is it that these men, living a very isolated life, many centuries in the future, how likely is it that they would retain a sort of folk memory of that? Well, I think it's more interesting to think that there would be some distant, maybe slightly warped, slightly inaccurate memories of those distant times, and perhaps even farther back. And so the faction symbol is actually, I'm sort of embarrassed it took me this long to notice it, but the faction symbol is actually for the House of Haleth, isn't it? And so I guess I thought it was like a stylized, I don't know, like a kind of a tree with no branches or something, because they're the Black Forest tribes, right? Like they're the Aaron people. It's sort of a forbidding-looking spiky tree, I guess, but no, that's the House of Haleth. So the idea we're going for is that these guys have some ancient folk memory of very, very early days, and these were somewhat similar to the Avari. In the sense that they didn't get very far in the first age, perhaps, but maybe some of the folk of Haleth, stuck behind, or their ancient relatives, or maybe some of them returned over the Blue Mountains just before the downfall of Numenor. Who knows? But the idea is that there's some references, some callbacks there. So let's jump into the campaign map and see what you can expect if you start up as the Black Forest tribes. So really how we've pictured the expansion of this faction is that they are very much centered on the Aaron. This is the wooded highlands, the sort of wooded piney peninsula on the west of Middle-earth, coming out just south of the Brandywine River, between that and the Grey Flood. This is where we imagine the power center would be. In the references in Unfinished Tales, and I think in the appendices maybe, to people living along the coast of the Gwathlo or the Grey Flood, near the mouths of that river, or between that river and the Eisen, the people here are described as, in not too flattering terms, right? A fairly numerous but barbarous fisher folk is one reference there. And they seem to be a people of relatively little account. So there doesn't seem to be too much excuse to imagine that there would have grown up this powerful chiefdom or confederacy or something. We see no mention of that in the sources. And since, of course, this mod is set in the Third Age, at a time when things were being recorded, right, then we don't want to invent on the middle of the map here a faction, a strong, confederation right off the bat. So probably the best position to start them off, we imagined, would be as these sort of isolated forest dwellers in the beginning. This is where they would have the opportunity to grow relatively strong. This is an area that didn't seem to suffer too much in the wars of the Second Age, because of course it retains its forests. Now, one thing you'll notice, however, is that this map overall has more forest cover than the Fourth Age Total War map. So there are relatively more trees on this map, but still you can tell that Aaron has quite a bit more. And so this seems to be the sort of place where you could imagine, something like in the Forest of Brethil, right, in the Silmarillion, in Beleriand. That's where the people of Haleth moved to. And I always sort of like to think of it as having a similar kind of material culture, similar maybe political organization, where you've got leaders of these small stockaded villages, very, very small, but still, defensible, still centers of power in a very local way. And so we imagined that that with the advent of the Third Age, with the troubles of between Gondor and Arnor, in the sense that those two kingdoms seem to have reached the height of their power long ago and are now sort of declining, that there opened up more opportunities potentially for people along the coast to try to steer their own fate. So we've got a couple of settlements here relatively close to one another. We've got what is going to be your capital, Vornhallen, pretty much in the woods here. And this is a faction, the Black Forest tribes are going to be one of the middlemen factions, right? So they're going to have that sort of cultural disposition, and you'll see that type of building structure. Your other settlement here is going to be in southern Minhiriath. Now, this is territory that once would have belonged to Cardolan, right? Which is, of course, had been destroyed for several hundred years at this point. But that does indicate a way that the Black Forest tribes could easily expand. In fact, taking territory of northern Minhiriath will be very, very straightforward, and possibly your first grab. You're going to have a rebel settlement right at the mouth of the Brandywine River. and that's going to put you in a good position to sort of consolidate some power, get some growth going in your settlements without too much fuss. Then you'll be expanding east, potentially, between those two rivers here. But there are a few crossings. As again, you may notice that we've got a bit of a crossing here just to make life a little bit easier for both you and the AI. Although we certainly imagine a lot of this expansion, in universe would have taken place, by small boats and so on as people moved along the coastline. That's probably just an easier way to travel around here. Still, we want to make things relatively easier for the player and the AI to manage. And so we've got a little bit of a crossing right here as well, right along the mouth of the Eisen. So this is a totally new crossing. This is a totally new crossing as well. I'm not sure if we've got one similarly at the mouth of this river. It doesn't look like it to me. Of course, we've got one around Sarn Ford, or where Sarn Ford would later be, but I don't think there are any new crossings along the lower parts of the Brandywine, which is probably intended to keep these Mannish factions a little bit separate from the elves. And we certainly, one of the few things, very few hints we get of these people, or possibly it was people of the Second Age, was that they pretty much avoided the Brandywine River because across that they thought of as elvish country. And it certainly would have been, right, in the Second Age, well before the advent of the kingdoms of Numenor in exile. But in addition to these couple of relatively closely connected settlements, you do have a couple along the coast farther south, bringing it up to a total of 4 to start. So the Black Forest tribes are in a pretty decent position in some ways. They're certainly not the smallest faction on the map. One in particular that is very interesting is Lond Aor. So this is kind of a happy accident, I suppose. It sounds very similar, at least to me, or it looks very similar at any rate, to Lond Dare, right, which is the old settlement of Vignalonde, right, from the Numenorians from... if you read the story Aldarion and Erendis, which is in Unfinished Tales, one of the few stories taking place entirely in the Second Age there, and also a fascinating story, one of my favorites, and I need to go back and read it again sometime. But this is the settlement that he established, and this fell into disuse, right? This did not really survive the great wars of the Second Age of Sauron. May have survived in ruins or something. So that's kind of how we're imagining this. This is certainly not a great Numenorian settlement. This is just some local river people, coastal folk, coastal tribal folk, just gathering together at a place that is probably a very suitable place for them, as the Numenorians would have found it. So they've got this small territory here. So you're really controlling both sides of the Gwathlo. But also this crossing here is particularly interesting to me because it opens up a potential for conflict and opportunity in the south. In the south means Gondor. So of course you've got the chiefdom of the Angren here, and if you were looking at the map, from sort of a bird's eye view, you may think, well, okay, before I get down to Gondor, right, normally I would have to go all the way along the Eisen, deal with these fortresses, at Orthanc and what would later be known as the Hornburg or Helm's Deep, and then, go down through the mountains, either to the west or to the east. But that's not really the case. For the Black Forest tribes, you can right off the bat head down towards Andrast, right? Now, some of this territory is going to start off as rebel. Druath ER is going to be one of those, which is also going to give you a bit of a hint as to the kind of units you may find in this territory, the Dru folk, the Druidine. So they will be something of a presence here, and something that you may be able to make use of as well, given that sort of ancient kinship between those people and the House of Haleth. But at any rate, it's only a hop, skip, and a jump over to Gondor, over to the White Mountains from your starting position. So that's something to give some thought to. How do you want to make your mark on the map as the Black Forest tribes? Very much a coastal faction. And so you could certainly continue that by just continuing to expand along the coast. You could even leapfrog over some of those rebel or independent territories and cause some damage really unexpectedly in the western fiefs of Gondor. But on the other hand, you could go inland and seize a lot of this territory, which again, rebel held, but is likely to be very friendly and amenable to your own middlemanish culture. You could seize control of the Great North-South Road and the forts that command it. That would, of course, set you up for some strong conflict with the chiefdom of the Angren to your east. But once you've dealt with them, I mean, you'd be in a very, very solid position, controlling essentially this giant rectangle of territory between the White Mountains, the Misty Mountains, and the rivers and the sea. But precisely because you've got all these rebel territories to your south and east, you really have a lot of choice, I think. So a completely different approach would have you playing defense in the south, trying to build up some of your settlements, because as you can tell, these are your smaller, weaker, less built up settlements. They're going to take a while before they're really useful. This one doesn't even have walls. This one does. It's as you might imagine from the site of a former settlement. This one does not. This one, geez, I can't tell. I don't think it does. So you don't actually have very many strongholds. You may want to therefore take your time before you go striking out in too many directions at once. But you could play defense down here and expand north and east and get into the Shire, which at this point is Arnor, right? So you could be the deciding factor in the war between Arnor and Angmar. Because at the beginning of the campaign, we're not totally sure exactly how we're going to set up the balance here for every single faction on the map. But one thing that we can absolutely do is make sure that the experience is a little bit different depending on which faction you've chosen. For the Black Forest tribes, you're probably going to start off neutral to absolutely everybody on the map, completely isolated, diplomatically speaking. And so, it may be a bit of an even fight here between Angmar and Arnor. I'm not totally sure, but, we may not want to have things too heavy-handed in one direction or another if you're playing the Black Forest tribes. But regardless, you could certainly find yourself in a position while those two factions are going at it to just suddenly come up from the south and take some excellent territory right out of the hands of Arnor. Going east perhaps first, seizing Tharbad for yourself, the old site of Tharbad, and then moving up towards Bree, even the Shire, maybe making war on the elves. Maybe you're bold enough to do that. That would be something rather interesting to see, I think, as well. This faction, I think, offers some really nice simplicity, some focus in terms of their unit roster, but in terms of the campaign, it seems completely wide open, and I'm really not sure what the best move is going to be once we have everything set up correctly. Because not only do you have a lot of options, but there's, of course, a lot of threats. If Gondor holds on too well in the south, they're going to come north at some point, right? They're going to come up into that rebel territory to your south, and then you're going to find yourself just facing them across the Eisen if you move too slowly. On the other hand, in the north, at some point there's going to be a victor that will emerge from the war between Arnor and Angmar, and they will be looking at expanding into the south, potentially into your territory. So while the beginning of the campaign could be fairly peaceful as the Black Forest tribes, you will have to prepare yourself for the onslaught that is to come. And by the time you get to that point where you're bumping up against these large empires, you will have to face the fact that you only have 3 tiers of military development. You do not have a deep unit roster. But by then you'll be facing enemies who may have 4 or 5 levels of military development and a very deep and varied unit roster themselves. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at the Black Forest tribes. Stay tuned to the channel, of course. We're going to have weekly updates for the foreseeable future for Total War Wainriders. Only a few more factions to go. We're going to be going back to the Anduin Vale, I think, for the next one. And then from there, who knows? But thank you very much for watching this one, and I hope to see you again soon. Until then, take care.